first of all, I'd like to welcome all of you here to our talk this evening for parents. And my name is Eilis Hennessy. I'm a professor of child psychology in the UCD School of Psychology. And with me, but invisible this evening, is Aine French, who is a research assistant working with me and some colleagues on a project funded by NOSP. Before I introduce our main speakers for this evening, I'm going to very quickly share two slides with you, just to tell you a little bit about the purpose of these talks. So these talks are part of a research project which is looking at parents' information needs in relation to young people's self-harm. So we would be really pleased if any of you here this evening have experienced having an adolescent who has self-harmed and would be willing to tell us what information would have been useful to you. So you can see there's a QR code on the screen. If you capture that QR code, you will be brought straight to the survey, but also Aine will put the link into the chat function over the course of the evening. And just to tell you that we have one final talk in this series, and that's by Coleman Noctor, who is a member staff in the School of Nursing in UCD, and he's a child and adolescent psychotherapist. And his talk is next Tuesday evening, November the 16th at 7 p.m. So you'd be very welcome to join us again then. And again, the QR code there will allow you to register with Eventbrite for that talk. Okay, so let me move along, and delighted to be welcoming here this evening our two guest speakers. So Madeleine Connolly is a senior psychiatric social worker and family therapist with Lucena Clinic. And Katie Murphy is a social worker with Lucena and is also a systemic practitioner. And they're going to tell us again about self-harm, what it is, and what we can do about it. So I'll hand over to you now, Madeleine and Katie.
Sure, thanks so much, Eilis. So I'm going to talk first for hopefully about 15-20 minutes, and then Madeleine will take over from me, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end. So I'm just going to share screen, and bear with me. So thanks so much for coming and signing up to listen to myself and Madeleine chatting a little bit about self-harm. I guess the first thing to say is, who am I and why is it me that's here talking to you about this? So I'm a social worker and I work in the Lucena Clinic, which is a community child and adolescent mental health team, or you might hear them referred to as CAMS teams. So I'm based there now. My background is in child protection work and in other CAMS teams across inpatient and community. Community basically means outpatient CAMS, so when the young person isn't in hospital, they're at home with their family and their care is at home. So that's my background. And I suppose I'm going to be talking from the perspective of a clinician working with young people who self-harm. So there'll be plenty of people who might have done more research than me, have more expertise than me, and I'm kind of really talking from my perspective from the conversations and the work I've done with young people. On top of being kind of a social worker and CAMS team, I'm also trained in a number of different talking therapies, and one of them, which I suppose is the most relevant to this, is DBT, or dialectical behavioural therapy, and that's just one type of many types of therapies that works with young people who self-harm, along with a range of other kind of traits that might make them appropriate for that therapy. So the things I'm going to talk to you about today are: what is deliberate self-harm? What are the different types of deliberate self-harm that we generally see? Why do some people start self-harming? Why do some people keep self-harming? Is self-harm a suicidal act? The link between shame and self-harm, some myths about self-harm, of which there are many, and some signs that a young person might be self-harming. Then Madeleine will go on to talk a little bit about how, as a parent or a person important to a young person who's self-harming, can respond to those behaviors when you believe your young person is self-harming. So deliberate self-harm, I mean, there's loads of different terms or phrases you might hear used to describe self-harm, depending on what country you're in or what clinician you're working with. The one I'm going to use today is deliberate self-harm. There's also just self-harm, self-molestation, non-suicidal self-injury. But deliberate self-harm is any deliberate act where people engage with the deliberate intent to cause harm to themselves. Self-harm is always a sign that there's something wrong and should always be taken seriously, but it's also really common. The Mental Health Foundation in the UK say that 10% of young people self-harm. Some of the types of self-harming that we see, and obviously self-harming is kind of a catch-all term for a range of different behaviours. But some of the main ones that we see as clinicians working with young people struggling with moderate to severe mental health difficulties, primarily cutting. Cutting is the biggest one, generally on arms, forearms, or thighs. But also some behaviours like self-burning, punching or hitting yourself, head banging, like banging your head against a wall. Some young people we see might pick at their skin, like pluck at their skin, or pick at wounds or scabs. Plucking out hair, like individual hair follicles from your head or eyebrows or eyelashes most commonly. And self-poisoning, which is another term for overdosing. Why do some people start self-harming? There's loads of reasons why people self-harm, and not all people are doing it for the same purpose. So one thing we have to be really cautious about is not assuming the reason or the cause of self-harm, because you might have heard of somebody self-harming for one reason doesn't mean that another person is self-harming for the same reason. So a big part of trying to help people to stop self-harming is about understanding why they're self-harming in the first place. And in particular, if it's with the intention to suicide or not. And I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about that. There's a range of reasons, and this is going to be kind of a cross section of some, but some of them that come up for young people that I see in my practice is some difficulties in relationships at home, arguments or problems with friends, school pressures, and particularly in the last couple of years with COVID and moving to Zoom school or exam years or all kinds of things to do at school, experiencing bullying. Then there's a range of different diagnoses people might have that include self-harming, like depression or anxiety. They might be experiencing low self-esteem. It might be prompted by being in a position in a period of transition in a young person's life, like changing schools, moving home, moving country, changing friendship groups, or alcohol and drug use. And again, there's many other reasons why somebody might be prompted to begin self-harming. Why do some people keep self-harming? So there's a big difference between trying self-harming and then continuing to self-harm. And one of the biggest things that we see with families that come in to work with us in CAM services is really struggling to understand the reason why their young person is doing this behavior that seems so kind of hard to understand, especially if you're somebody who's never experienced any urges to self-harm before. A lot of the time, actually, young people come in and they themselves don't really know exactly why or what they get out of self-harming initially, and then that kind of understanding comes out of exploration with them in sessions with us. And the fact of not understanding not only can be distressing for family members, siblings, friends, and parents, but also can be really distressing for the young person themselves if they're doing this behavior, but they're not really sure why, and they often really don't want to continue it. So some of the things that young people have said to me in my work are that it helps me to feel something else other than the emotional pain I'm feeling. It distracts me from difficult thoughts, feelings, or memories. Sometimes young people are so caught up and so stuck in the thoughts or feelings that they're having in the moment, and are so desperate for a way to get rid of them, or to not to shift their focus, or to be able to move away from them, that they use self-harm as a way to distract themselves. It helps me to feel something. And sometimes we see young people who are saying, I just feel numb. I'm not feeling any emotion, like the full range, can't feel happy, sad, joy, excitement, also not feeling low, sadness, fear, anxiety, any of those things. So a way to be able to feel something when I'm not able to feel anything, because feeling nothing can be hugely distressing. It can be a way to feel in control when life generally is feeling out of control, or elements of life are feeling out of control. So it's one thing that a young person might feel like, this is something that I'm able to do, and that I can choose, I control how much I do it, when I do it, what it looks like. It can be a way of self-punishing. So sometimes young people might feel like they deserve to be hurt. They might be feeling a lot of pain, or they might be feeling like they're a burden. They might be reflecting, or they might be a young person that gets really caught up in shame around behaviors that they've done recently, or times that they've let people down, even if you don't think that they have actually done anything very significant, and of course nothing to deserve self-punishment. Some young people might get really, really caught up in shame or guilt about their behavior, and then feel like it's a way to punish themselves for it. It can feel like a release, like a literal way to get the painful feelings out of them when they're feeling full up with difficult emotions. It can be a physical way to release those emotions. And finally, it can let people know that I'm not okay when and that they'll then help me. Often young people who self-harm really struggle with telling people they're struggling, with even understanding themselves why they're struggling, with putting it into words, with trying to not only understand it themselves and be able to think through what it is that's going on for them, but then to be able to iterate it to somebody else, and somebody else who they don't know how they'll respond. So a way to be able to do that, if they haven't got the skill set to be able to let people know that they need help or aren't okay, is to self-harm. And again, there's a range of other reasons, and the reasons are far-reaching and they don't look the same. One person self-harming might experience it completely differently to another person that's self-harming. So again, really important to understand what's causing it, what's keeping it going, what does the young person get out of it that they don't know how to get otherwise. All behavior, like DBT would say, all behavior is caused. So if you're not understanding why a young person is behaving the way they are, it means you just haven't got it yet. You haven't found the logic to it. It's not that it's illogical. There is a logic there, and we just have to figure out what it is to be able to help them. We describe self-harm as a maladaptive coping strategy. That means that it's often a way of coping with distress, but the maladaptive piece is where we're saying actually it can work effectively in the short term, as in it can do all these things that young people are saying it does for them. That's real. They do experience it like that. But in the long term, it can cause more pain, more suffering, more distress, or more problems. Like it could lead to people getting angry with them or frustrated with them, people shouting at them or telling them that they need to stop it, people saying that they're disappointed in them, and getting socially ostracized. You know, there can be lots of kind of punishment that people experience for self-harming. So in the long term, it can make their lives worse, but in the short term, it can help. So it's a maladaptive coping strategy because it actually doesn't get rid of the problem. It also gets in the way of them being able to do something more skillful. Like if self-harm is being triggered by interpersonal difficulties, then instead of figuring out how to relate to somebody else differently, or how to solve a problem, or how to repair after a conflict, it's kind of a replacement for that, and it gets in the way of being able to do those things that will kind of stop the problem from continuing to happen. So I suppose when we talk about maladaptive coping strategies, I'd say that everybody can relate to the concept that, or the idea of having an urge to do things to manage challenging feelings that we know may not be the most helpful thing for us in the long term, but in the short term it works well, or it feels good. And this is not to say that these behaviors are the same as self-harming, but if we try to think about it in a way that helps us relate to young people who are doing this. I mean, I imagine how many people that are on this call have had a really stressful day in work, or had a big argument with somebody and gone home and had a glass of wine or had a cigarette, and long term they're thinking, I don't want to be managing my emotions by drinking, or I don't want to be managing my emotions by smoking, and maybe it's causing me harm and maybe it's not good for me in the long term, but right now it feels good, or it makes things feel better. So the big difference between these behaviors and self-harming behaviors is that the point of the self-harming is the harm bit. So it's actively harming as a way to get the results of harming. Whereas these behaviors that we're talking about, other maladaptive coping strategies, although they cause harm in the long term, they're not done with the intention of the harm that comes out of them. So some of them that I've listed there are things like drinking alcohol, taking drugs, gambling, having promiscuous sex, over or under eating. And I imagine other people on this call will be able to add to that list of things that they might do or they've heard of other people doing that don't help them in the long term, but kind of work well or meet a need for themselves in the short term. Is self-harming a suicidal act? Suppose the language around self-harming can make this feel complicated. So self-harming sometimes, yes, can be an act with the intention of suicide, like self-poisoning or overdosing can be done with the intention of dying. But for the most part, self-harm or deliberate self-harm is actually the opposite of a suicidal act, in that the intention of self-harm is a way to cope. It's a way to get through a difficult moment with the expectation that that difficult moment will pass. It's a strategy for getting through it without maybe doing other things that might make your life worse. On the flip side, a suicidal act is a reflection of somebody feeling like they can't tolerate their emotions, they won't get through the moment, and they need to get out of the situation the only way they know how. And so they're kind of opposing behaviors. Generally, so this kind of broad language around self-harming can be confusing because of that, because we include stuff like self-poisoning in the definition of self-harming. But usually if you meet a clinician in a mental health service, they will use different language to describe it based on the intention. So if the intention was to suicide, somebody took an overdose with the intention of suiciding, clinicians will usually use terms like suicide attempt or suicidal behavior. They will usually use terms like deliberate self-harm when the intention is understood to have been a coping strategy or a way to manage that didn't have the intent of dying. So it's really important to remember there is a link. Like often if people experience suicidal thoughts, they may also display self-harming behavior, but they are not the same thing. And many people have urges to self-harm without having urges to suicide. So again, really important to think, how do I understand the reason behind this behavior? And like I said, what you see when somebody self-harms, you're seeing the behavior, you're not seeing the intention. When you love somebody or care about somebody, your brain is going to go straight into overdrive of determining or figuring out what the reason is that they did it. And your brain will tell you that you know the reason, that you see the self-harming, and so you interpret that as meaning something like they want to die or something else. But remember, you're only seeing the behavior, and the intention is much more complex and needs a lot more exploration, either by yourself in your role or by a clinician in a service, or both, or many other options. We need to remember that self-harming is a problematic but really effective, unfortunately, short-term strategy. It can do those things that kids listed that it does for them really quickly. It can be easily accessed. Often young people are able to self-harm without needing many kind of tools or like much to their disposal. And it works really, really quickly because it is so powerful. It's such a stark thing to do, to draw this kind of pain for yourself, that it works really well to counteract or to create the kind of effects that some young people might be looking for. When young people have, or any of us have, emotions that feel intolerable, we all have the urge to use the best strategy that we have at our disposal to be able to manage it. Sometimes we might manage to use strategies that help us in the long term, and sometimes we're just so desperate to be able to get rid of those emotions that we'll do whatever is at our disposal to be able to do that. Shame and self-harm. So these two things are really inextricably linked. You cannot really separate shame and self-harm. Most young people that we see that self-harm are extremely ashamed of it, tend to self-harm in private, shut down conversations about it, avoid talking about it, do it in secret. And so we need to be really aware that actually we need to avoid using any shaming language or blaming language when we talk to young people about self-harm. They already feel the shame. And the difficulty is actually increasing shame will not decrease self-harming behavior. In fact, we see shaming or shame as a pervasive experience. self-harm can lead to lots of shame, but equally the more shame somebody feels, the more urges they may have to be able to get rid of that distress feeling, get rid of that shame by self-harming. Some of the common myths about self-harm, and there are many, and I've already kind of covered some so far, but that self-harming is always a suicidal act, which we talked about. Sometimes it is, but mostly it's a way of coping. People who self-harm are attention-seeking, and I suppose we'd say some people who self-harm are trying to use self-harm as a way to communicate that they're distressed and they're not okay. There's a big difference between attention-seeking and seeking help or trying to communicate needs. People who are self-harming are doing it to manipulate others, and that's about kind of the difference between the outcome and the intention. You might, as a parent or a person close to a young person self-harming, feel manipulated as a result of their self-harm. That doesn't mean that their self-harm was done with the intention of manipulating you. Only adolescent self-harm, it is more common in adolescence, but people self-harm throughout life. People who self-harm don't feel pain. Again, they do feel pain, but they might experience it differently than people who don't, because they get some positive benefits out of self-harming. So the experience of the pain can be both painful and bring other emotions. Self-harm is very rare, and we've talked about that's not the case. Self-harm is a goth thing. There's no evidence to say that it has anything to do with that kind of group. Only girls self-harm. It's more common in girls, but it's people of all genders self-harm. And people who self-harm enjoy it. I've yet to meet a young person who enjoys self-harming. Some young people will be resistant to the idea of stopping self-harming, but mainly that's because of the belief that they don't know how to get the outcomes that they're looking for, or to be able to manage the emotions without using that tool that they have at their disposal. Signs that a young person is self-harming, and this is kind of a crammed slide because there are many, and also because lots of the signs that somebody is self-harming might also be signs of something else. So I'd really flag, if you're a young person or the person that you're thinking about is displaying these behaviors, don't assume it means that they're self-harming. These can be signs that they're self-harming, but it's all about having a conversation with them or seeking help from somebody who can talk to them about it. So things like withdrawal or isolation from everyday life, wearing inappropriate clothing, so like wearing long sleeves or heavy stuff in summertime, or resistance to wearing exposing clothes like shorts for pajamas or swimming togs, changes in mood, eating habits, activity, talking about self-harm or suicide, changes in behavior like abusing drugs or alcohol, expressing feelings of failure, uselessness, loss of hope, or being a burden. And we often hear young people in our service talking about feeling like they're a burden to others. Risk-taking behavior, signs of low self-esteem or lack of self-compassion, then some unexplained cuts, bruises, or injuries, being quieter than usual and lacking energy. And again, we'd be saying, talk to a young person or ask them who you can take them to talk about what's going on for them, because you're noticing signs. You don't know if it means you're self-harming, but you're worried based on the signs you're seeing. And finally, the message that understanding self-harm is not the same as condoning self-harm. If you give space to a young person to talk about why they're self-harming, it is not you sending the message that you agree with them self-harming or that you want them to continue to self-harm. But if you shut down conversations, if you stop young people from being able to explore or talk about or get help about their self-harm, you're going to miss the mark. They're not going to talk to you about it. They're going to struggle to do exactly the things that are leading to them self-harming, and you're not going to be able to help them effectively. So open up a space to be able to understand why a young person is self-harming or might be self-harming. You're not sending them the message that you're okay with it or that you're happy for them to continue. So that's the end of my talk. There'll be questions and answers at the end after Madeleine does her piece, but I'll stop sharing now and let Madeleine do a bit of chatting.
Thanks, Katie.
No problem.
So good evening, everybody. And I can see by the numbers that this is a huge problem for many, many people out there. So Katie and I were just saying earlier how delighted we are to be part of this conversation, because that's what we're seeing too coming into the clinic in Lucena, where we both work. So I suppose I'm going to share my experiences of what parents have found have helped while I have worked with them and sometimes the young person who are self-harming. However, I work mostly with parents in trying to contain the situation when things are at a crisis level. And I have to say that I think one of the most difficult and distressing and painful experiences that you can face as a parent or carer is responding to your young person who expresses a desire not to live anymore, or who harms or engages in harm on themselves in any way. And I've seen that shock and upset that parents experience, and the guilt and the overwhelming feelings that they have, and the confusion and the anger and lots of emotions that they have. And so, you know, I think when things are at its worst for parents, I think it's always to remind yourself that whatever stage you are at in the process, and some of you may be further down the road than others, the self-harming behavior originally started as a way to manage painful emotions, as Katie said earlier. So I'm going to try and just share some ideas that may work for you around family, around a particular type of parenting, around adolescence, you know, what that stage of life means, specifically around de-escalation and how to contain and anchor yourself in the face of these very intense emotions that young people are expressing. And also how to get used to validating and supporting, and as Katie said, without condoning or without supporting the actual behaviours. So I'm a systemic therapist, and as is Katie, and I suppose we see everything, systems theory is like the human body, where we see all the parts as being dependent on each other. So this is how we experience and try to formulate, I suppose, our work around self-harm as social workers and systemic therapists in the clinics. So we are always seeing high levels of escalation. You know, this is an intense, when you have a young person who experiences intense emotions, and maybe if you have more than one child, only one of your child reacts like this, or young people reacts like this, there are very often high levels of escalation between parent and child involved. We see negative coping patterns becoming entrenched in families where, you know, parents are at a loss and feeling helpless as to what to do. And sometimes they're giving in, and sometimes they're trying to adapt to minimize the harm, but may also not be sure that they're doing the right thing. We see parents becoming isolated from their extended families. We see children and young people becoming isolated from their own peer groups because they're trying to manage this terrible problem that's in their lives. You know, we work with parents who have got to that point of feeling helpless and hopeless. We see relations between family members strained. You know, family members can be the best at times, and they can not be helpful at other times. We also have to give a bit of voice to siblings here who also may feel, you know, that they've been left out or they're not being given attention to. Very important part of our work. And then I think there's so much media and news and coverage, you know, particularly around during the pandemic, around the heightened threats of contemporary issues like eating disorders, internet use, and anxiety. I mean, this really just serves to heighten parents who already heightens anxiety. So we try to work very hard at balancing what's happening out there for parents. So parents are trying to maintain a balanced and safe family life in the face of this ongoing crisis. And you're parenting somebody who experiences emotions intensely. And parents will say, I'm walking on eggshells around him. I'm upset that his siblings or her siblings are witnessing the distress, the aggression, the evidence of self-harm. And what we would say is try to focus on your relationship with your young person, and to spend time with those people who you feel validate you and understand the experience that you're going through. Acknowledge the distress of the siblings and their upset, and try to tune into what's going on for them as well. And then, of course, there's the young person themselves, you know, feeling disconnected from friends, disconnected from family, and disconnected from themselves quite often, feeling misunderstood and judged and isolated. So I suppose the bottom line for many of you as parents and carers is that quite often, if they can be, parents are hardwired to soothe their children. They're hardwired to take care of their needs when they're young. And what often happens when young people come into us in the clinic is that what worked before in being able to soothe or satisfy your child or your young person just is not working any longer. And that can have a very, an effect on a parent's confidence in their parenting skills. So if you think of the idea of an anchored parent may result in an anchored child, we work hard to try and help the parents with that anchoring function. And to focus, as Katie said, on the interactions rather than the behaviors, not to dismiss the behaviors, of course. So what are the challenges for parents? I suppose tuning into their emotions is often a challenge. I find parents can be really on it, you know, when we're asking them to sweep the rooms, to remove any quick access to any tools that may cause harm. But they struggle sometimes a bit more with tuning into the young person's emotions. And this is often because they've been pushed away for a long time by that young person. They haven't been let into their lives. And it's very hard for them to get back in there and to show them that they care. It's like living in a constant state of turmoil for some parents. So you've got to find out what works for you. You've got to try not to judge yourself as a parent or a carer, and certainly not to accept the judgment of other people who are around you. And recognize your own limits and reach out and try and get support. Because we all have limits in looking after our young people when we're under stress. So validating their emotions, as Katie said again, without supporting their harming behaviors. When I talk about self-regulation, I mean parent self-regulation. How can you regulate yourself in the face of this distress and hold hope for yourself, for your family, and for your young person? And really one of the biggest changes I see in families is when they step out of that secrecy and they ask for help and they ask for support, and they don't see this as a failure in themselves or a failure in their young person or a failure in their parenting. As we all know, adolescence is a time of growth and change. We've all been through it. Secrecy and privacy are a feature of adolescent life. And a young person's desire for privacy should not really get in the way of protecting them, certainly if there are suicidal urges or intent. Your role is to do what you can to keep them safe. You know, as I said, sweeping the room, removing easy access to means to injure. And young people will say, actually, that was really helpful, not having immediate access to means of hurting myself. And what my mother did is she put I made sure there was ice in the freezer, and I was able to go to that and hold the ice, and that gave me some satisfaction for those moments. The message you're going to give is, I will do everything I can to keep you safe until you can keep yourself safe. The message is that you care about and love your young person and will do everything you can, except give in to threats, to keep them safe. I mean, often parents, and certainly more and more parents I'm seeing, are not aware of the self-harming behaviors. And I mean, this is where we have to see it as a reaction to stress. If you can't see the self-harming behaviors, and usually, you know, they're on parts of their bodies where you can't see it, in those cases, it is distress really, because they don't want it to be found out. So parents always have concerns about their young people and may bring them to a GP, and it's only when they're at the GP that they see the evidence of the self-harming. Or sometimes it's a teacher or a coach or a friend of theirs mother or father or parent or carer who gets in touch with the parent to let them know. So please don't feel too bad if you didn't know, because that was the whole object of the exercise, is that it was impossible to express what was going on for them and how they're managing their distress. And parents feel helpless and unable to fix things for the young person. And as I said, I saw parents, and they were really in shock because they had a really good relationship with their young person. It was a father and his daughter. And he said, I used to be able to work this stuff out with her, and I just can't do that at the moment. And maybe there's some relief from the fact that some people experience intense emotions, and we now have scientific evidence to support this. And maybe parents can get a sense of relief from knowing that they're not to blame, and can feel more confident in learning effective skills to respond to these intense emotions that your young person is feeling, and to try and access access them in some way and assist them to make better decisions and healthier decisions in response to difficult situations. And validating their emotional state can make a big difference, when they're upset. And when emotions are heightened, I have this here because I think it's helpful for us to see it, the capacity to think and understand and process new or challenging events in the moment can result in self-harming as a coping strategy. The meltdown mode or, an overactive emotion center can lead to these escalations between parent and young child. And the flight or fright piece of a young adolescent's brain is totally developed. So running away, pushing away, hiding away from pain, they'd be very expert at that. The problem solving part of their brain and the rational part of the brain is certainly impacted on when they have intense emotions. It's harder to access it, as it is for any of us who are very stressed or very overwrought. It's hard for us to think rationally in those moments. We have to try and calm ourselves down and think straight about things. So we talk about this anchoring function and relational parenting, and it's really about how can we reach and develop this relationship with our young person, you know, while they're in such pain. So how can you be with is what we say, or stay with those emotions when your young person isn't able to regulate themselves? And that's a very hard thing for parents to do. Firstly, because they may be being pushed away constantly, you know, feeling rejected by their young person. But it's difficult for the young person to access their rational and reasoning mind, which as Katie said earlier, we go straight to reason as parents often in these situations. But it's difficult for your young person to access that when they're overwhelmed and feeling out of kilter and out of sync with the people that they love and the people they want to be closest to and all of their social systems. And they can be triggered so easily, you know, by an argument or a falling out with a friend or school pressure or a traumatic event or previous trauma. And this can really result in them being even harder to reach in terms of the sort of rational mind. So what we sort of recommend in some ways, and I've borrowed this from Dr. Bruce Perry, I hope he doesn't mind, I'm not an expert in neuroscience, but I love the illustration. So we're trying to help parents to develop an awareness that by slowing down, thinking strategically and wisely, and incorporating both emotion and reason into your response, and starting at that regulate stage. So first we regulate ourselves as parents in the face of, you know, this situation, and then we try to wait until we can regulate, or the young person can regulate themselves. And by doing that, I will show you a few tips on how to do that. And the relate piece then connects, you know, how do we connect with them, validate that what they're going through is really hard and really bad for them. And, you know, then, and only then, you know, as I call striking when the iron is cold, only then do we try and get to the rational problem solving part of their brain that is developing. And we have to accept in a way that our young person, you know, where they're at this moment, and hold on to the hope that it will pass for them and it will pass for us. And accept that you're doing your best as parents at that time and that you can't fix or change your young person. They need to develop, with your support and other people's support, the skills to be able to do this themselves. So sometimes this is a handy sort of a way of looking at things, is that for parents, it can result in what we call an anxious paralysis, like when the threats of self-harm and suicide prevents us from taking any action. It's like we're frozen and we just accommodate as much as possible rather than, you know, that walking on eggshells idea, rather than push them into a worse state. And sometimes parents would get it into a demanding stance, confrontating, or for God's sake, will you stop that? Don't be doing that. You know, you don't need to do that. Or calling their bluff. Go ahead, do it. Now, parents do these in moments of anxiety and stress. There's no doubt about that. So we try and help them to move into what might be a more supportive parental stance. I'll do anything in the world, still staying firm, really, as parents, to keep you safe from harm without giving into threats or giving up on you. So we're constantly trying to help parents. We've all been at all of these stances as parents, trying to bring them back to what would be helpful here for your young person. And one of the ways of doing that is to avoid any escalations, to delay your response. I'm talking about, you know, self-harm where there isn't necessarily at this point a very high risk to life, obviously, or any risk to life or serious injury. So these are the opportunities to take, you know, when there has been self-harm, but it's not critical in terms of danger, if you like. So to delay your response, give the young person a bit of safe space, you know, to come back down to that regulation stage. And to say, two parents I work with say, we're going to stay in the house, we're going to stay downstairs here for the next 24 hours. We're not going to go anywhere. And if there's anything we can do, we're here for you. So they didn't go into the room. They didn't go into the young person's space. They tried to give them space, but let them know that they were there. Over talking can be a trap that we all fall into as parents, particularly when we're stressed. So it's to calm down the talk, clear statements, calm statements, and understand that you can come back to these things later when your young person has possibly calmed down a bit, and when they're not getting into the fight with you, I suppose. So this again is what we call the delay principle, because when we're stressed, this usually leads to short-term thinking. It can be difficult to plan. So if you can reduce your own stress, you can increase a more strategic response and increase your planning. So think about what must happen for you to delay your response, to move from a reactive response to a more responsive response. And what supports do you need to do this? And I had parents the other day I was working with who found it so difficult not to be crashing into the room because of their concern for their young person. And really, it was just going to escalate the situation in that case. So we've got to remember that your own capacity to think can be blocked when you're at the height of your emotions as well, your fear, your anger, your upset that's coming out for your child that you love and care for. So you have to think, do I need to address this now or can I wait? What will happen if I get into this now? Is this an opportunity for me to stop and wait? As I call it, it's your pause button. It's not your delete button. You can come back to it when you need to. So what has to happen for you to stay on the ground floor and to let your young person with all these intense emotions go up to the next floor, but to stay grounded and not go up there with them? Not be, I shout, you shout loud, or, this kind of fight almost that you get into with your young person. Of course, it's only out of care and wanting to help them, but it's not always helpful to deal with things in that way at that point. So you're trying to develop sort of more a calmer approach to these, because already your young person is in a state that isn't calm. So we also look at the strengths of this young person. And again, as I said, we see things systemically. We see everything is interrelated. So the strengths of your young person or people in your care may be what's happening for them in the community, family. There might be one teacher in a school who they can relate to. Therapy, obviously, for self-harm, individual therapy can be really, really, really helpful. School and college and work opportunities, the very thing that they're avoiding sometimes are the opportunities to feel a sense of belonging in the world, a sense of belonging to community. And in the earlier stages of self-harm, young people may have a positive view and have said, I have quite a positive view of myself. I'm pretty good at things, I'm captain of the team and I'm very popular in school. So while they might be self-harming, they haven't got to the point where they've really entrenched it as a maladaptive, as Katie said, way of responding to threats. So it's really good to get in there, when you can and as early as you can. And the vulnerabilities, of course, are that the same things that could potentially lead them to supports are also the things that they may be withdrawing or avoiding and feeling isolated from. And interpersonal relationships, we all exist in relation to the people around us. And that's really important to young people. So we've got to look at where are the strengths for this young people. And as importantly, where are the strengths for you as parents and you as carers? What are your support networks that can help you? What are your support systems? Who in your friends and families can actually offer you support? How can you improve the relationship with your young person without getting into any escalations? And parents would often say, but I can't ask them for help. They have enough troubles of their own. But I'm guessing that any of you out there who are friends or have a friend would want a friend to ask you when they're in trouble for help, and that you'd probably say, I'll do what I can to help you. I'm glad you asked. And then there are the vulnerabilities of parents and carers. And of course, there's so many of them that we have to work with, feeling isolated and actually being isolated. The same sense that a young person might feel, guilt and shame that I'm not a good enough parent. This shouldn't be happening. What have I done wrong? So we've got to try and help them to move from that helpless and hopeless state by asking for help. Also, this is really important for feeling erased and unimportant in their young person's life. And that is not true. You're not unimportant. You haven't been erased, but you've got to work at making that connection to let them know you're still here. But that is a very real feeling that parents will have, is that I feel erased. It's a word they used for my young person's life. And I was so much part of it when they were younger. So provide a supportive, anchored presence if you can. Offer dressings and balm for healing scars. Rather than asking, about the self-harm, you can say, don't forget to put the balm on that we talked about. Plan distractions, really key trick. You know, try to make it as attractive as possible to be with people and be downstairs and out of the isolation of the room. And connect with the emotions rather than the act. Support the distress tolerance skills. If they are going to a therapist, they will be being taught those. So if you know a bit about them, you can support them with them. And always notice when this self-harm isn't around. It's like externalizing it. God, I noticed you were having a great laugh with your friends on the phone the other day. So your narrative doesn't become just focused around the self-harm and them as the problem, that you can broaden your conversation with them and not always just talk about the self-harm. You know, and I'm not even going to go through the don'ts because I'm guessing all of you here probably know them already. You know, now I was talking to Katie about having this talk about the self-harm, you know, and letting the therapist do this. And I think there's something about getting the balance between other conversation and introducing difference, but obviously still staying connected and letting them know you're concerned about them, and that you're really going to try and help them to find a different way of managing their distress. So this is one paper that I read on it and what can parents do. So an unwanted reaction named by a young person was, you know, my mother ignores it, my best friend doesn't care. And somebody said to me, you're reacting, this isn't a big deal. And then another one said, well, my mom and dad knew about it. They paid for my therapy and they treat me with love and I can tell it's genuine. Now, these are just quotes from a particular paper that I read. So positive supervision, not to be, I suppose, overwhelming to your young person, to be positive around them and try and create a positive atmosphere, to understand that they will have little blips where they might revert to it, but to say, okay, let's start again tomorrow. That was just a blip. Let's get back on track here. What the paper I read where young people were interviewed is they said that we want people not to think of self-harm as one universal thing that's happening out there. I'm a unique person. My self-harm is unique to my circumstances, and I need people to understand that and why I'm struggling and why I self-injure. I'm not the same as the person up the road who's doing it. We have to understand that uncomfortable thoughts and emotions can trigger self-harm. Like elevated stress and distress can lead to those defense systems not working. You know, our rational mind and our wise mind isn't working. And as I said, support your young people with increasing healthy coping mechanisms. Validate the pain that underlies the self-harming behavior without validating the behavior. Focus on the pain and disappointment and hopelessness and misery. And most of us would probably try and avoid that conversation, say you're grand, or let's distract immediately. But actually what we're finding is that to validate it, that this is real for this young person, is really helpful for them to hear. So a non-invalidating comment might be, maybe it's for the best that your boyfriend, sorry, I'm trying to move, there's something in my way here, that your boyfriend left. Or there'll be other boyfriends. My father used to say, there's plenty more fish in the sea. Or we're sure these feelings will pass. But the young person hearing these may experience these comments as invalidating. You don't get me. You don't know what's going on for me. You're not even listening to me. But a validating comment, now I get how miserable you felt when you broke up with your boyfriend. I can't imagine how hard this must be for you. And we're here for you whenever you want us to be. So I think you might need to practice that. You know, what's a validating, what's an invalidating? What would I want to hear if I was in pain? And what would I not want to hear? You know? And support. They always look for the exceptions to the problem, because the young person needs to know also that there is an existence outside of their self-harm and they may have not noticed it anymore. I noticed that you were, I don't know, notice what they're doing when they're not preoccupied with self-harm. Notice when they're sharing their day with you, talking to their friends on the phone, doing their homework, doing everything else. Acknowledge and reinforce the healthy behaviours. And if a child's in treatment and does not require medical attention, try not to give it additional attention, but that is a fine balance, as Katie said. It's about both, you know, acknowledging it and validating it, but also understanding that they can learn to manage this, that this isn't something that they're stuck with forever. Help by creating a soothing and pleasure environment. Of course, a lot of people we see, there might be conflict in the family or there might be other stuff going on. And these are adding to the stresses for these young people. So it's about trying to be conscious of that and trying to, you know, make the environment as pleasurable as possible for this young person growing up. Manage your own emotional reactivity. to your young person's self-harming behaviors. Of course, it's hard not to react. As I said, we're wired to soothe our young people. But it's about taking responsibility for what supports do I need and who do I need to help me with this? And create an environment that allows your young person to engage in the activities that they might enjoy. So that's kind of me done. I hope you found that helpful. Really happy to take questions. There, I'm sure, will be a lot of questions, and unfortunately, there's no easy answers any more than there are any easy, parental responses to these situations. So I'm going to stop sharing now. We can go back to the questions then.
Thank you so much, Madeleine and Katie. And just before I go on to questions, and we have just a few minutes for questions, I would just like to remind people that we are looking for the experiences of people who have experienced self-harm of an adolescent. And if you would be willing anonymously to share your views on what information would be helpful, we'd be really, really grateful. So we're not asking for information about your son or daughter or the self-harm itself. Rather, we're interested in what you would have found useful at the time. And as well as the QR code here, Aine has been sharing the link in chat. So if you go back through chat, you'll find that. So now we've got a lot of questions, and I want to acknowledge immediately that unfortunately we won't be able to answer them all. I was struck, Madeleine, that a lot of them that came before you started talking about what a parent can do were actually focused on that. It's like, what can I do when if my son or daughter doesn't want to talk to me about it? So I think you gave some really, really, really helpful tips. One thing I wanted to ask you both, just very briefly, for people who've never had anything to do with therapy, or who've never had a son or daughter in therapy, what does it mean to go to therapy? Like what will happen if you go along to a clinic and with your son or daughter?
Do you want to take that, Katie, first?
Sure. I guess the first thing to say is, like we've talked about lots, like not all self-harm is the same. It's not all rooted in the same explanation. So it can really vary, because therapy tends to be matched, or the plan for supporting people tends to be matched to what we think is going on for them and why they're struggling as they are. And self-harm might be one symptom of their distress, but actually what we're looking for when a young person and their family come into a service like ours or another community services, what's the story around this? Why is this behavior presenting? Why is it presenting now? What's worked before? And so really kind of getting a what we call a formulation or a story around it. Depending on that story, we make decisions about what kind of treatment they might get. But so just kind of an overview, that different kinds of treatment might be group therapy, where they attend a group and learn a bit about how distress is experienced, how anxiety is experienced, or they might learn skills of how to manage, depending on the kind of group they're put in, again, to match what we think is happening for them. They might get individual therapy, and there's lots of different kinds. But individual therapy with young people is they come in on a weekly or fortnightly basis, and there'll be a plan around what the therapy is going to tend to. Some therapies talk about past events, some therapies focus on how you're coping in the moment right now. There's no lying on a couch or no eyes closed for the most part, or at least Madeleine, I don't know.
Not my room.
Not my style. And I don't know anybody else in my service who their therapy be structured like that. So we match for the age of the child coming in. And then there might be some therapeutic interventions like DBT, which involves individual therapy and skills groups. There might be a group with parents. Then there's also family therapy, where whole families will attend, sometimes parents and the young person, or sometimes parents, young person and siblings, or whoever we think is important. And then sometimes there's therapeutic work with parents again, when they come in and talk through what's going on, what's worked before, what we think is going to be helpful now. So it's all based on matching to the young person's needs and the family's needs in the moment.
And just to add to that, Eilis, quite often the self-harming behaviours reduce when we're dealing with the bigger problem that they haven't been able to talk about. That the self-harming does minimise when we're addressing then the supports they need in school or other things that are happening for them.
sometimes even therapy, we won't talk about self-harm. We'll talk about all different things, and the self-harm, while you attend to the other things we think might be causing it or might be driving us, the self-harm will reduce. So it might not even involve any conversation about self-harm, except we'll be doing like assessing risk and feeding back any information that involves.
I'm sure you've loads of questions, have you, first?
No, actually not that many, but could I just say that I'm just looking in chat there, and I would ask you both to look in chat, because people are saying how wonderfully helpful they found your talk this evening. So I'd like you to know how helpful everybody has found it. I think Anya, who is hidden, may have chosen a couple of questions to ask.
I suppose before I do that, just a reminder as well that anyone who didn't get their questions answered today, as Eilis was pointing out, we won't have time for everyone, but that was addressed in the first talk. If anyone needs their question addressed and it didn't get addressed, it was discussed in the first talk. But yeah, so lots of really interesting questions. But one of the ones that's coming up a lot, actually, this is a bit of an amalgamation of about 3 or 4 questions, but around anxiety and self-harm. A couple of people were asking about skin picking or that kind of side of things around anxiety, if there's something you want to say on that.
Yeah, I suppose my work with them, I mean, I think anxiety is behind most behaviors. You know, I think there's an element of anxiety behind most behaviors, and, you know, I'd be pretty sure about that. So sometimes it's about looking at what are the functions of those behaviors in relation to managing the anxiety. Quite often in my work, I run programs for parents of young people who are anxious, because parents find that they may be accommodating some of the behaviors and helping their young people to avoid the challenges that are causing them anxiety, when in fact they'd feel better if they could in some ways be a little bit exposed to them. Or they find that they're adapting again, it's about getting into a supportive stance. They're adapting their behavior to accommodate the anxieties, and therefore the young people aren't really experiencing them. But skin picking and, you know, anxiety has to be addressed. You know, a young person who has anxiety is not going to get through that on their own. They do need help. They do need support. It's not always, to be honest, at a level of our clinic. It could be at a level that isn't for our clinic. There's lots parents can do to manage anxiety if you get the information from the right sources. So I think people are often on our list too long, but actually could do quite a lot in the meantime if they had access to the right information. They could do so much in the meantime themselves to manage anxiety in their young people.
And I guess just to add, for the most part, the treatment for anxiety is doing the thing that makes you anxious, and that can feel really weird and confusing for parents and for young people who've been working hard to avoid the anxious stuff. So sometimes if anxiety and self-harming behavior are paired together, it might involve still encouraging the child to lean into their anxiety, do those anxiety-provoking things, help them learn alternative skills, then the self-harming to manage it. But it might risk sometimes some increase in self-harming behavior for the young person to learn how to tolerate anxiety, that they can have anxiety and survive, get through it, and do the thing that's important to them. And
then on the other extreme, you know, anxiety requires psychiatry, it requires medication, it requires, you know, balance so that they can, you know, be open to learning, be open. And I mean, it depends on the level of anxiety and how it's impacting on their lives. I saw a question there about CBT, and certainly cognitive behavioral therapy can work quite well with certain young people. You know, and people with a certain amount of reflective capacity and insight can do quite well with cognitive behavioral therapy. But one therapy is not necessarily going to be good for someone else. So it's really a matter of trying to fit the right response to, as that young person said, I'm unique with my anxiety. You have to fit the right response to the right person, if you like. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So listen, I see it's just 8 o'clock. Madeleine and Katie, thank you so much for really informative presentations. And as I say, if you look in chat, you'll see how grateful everybody is. Just to remind everybody that this talk has been recorded. It will be going up on the website that Anya has linked into there. It's the UCD School of Psychology Youth Mental Health Lab website. And actually there are some great other resources there as well. So there's the talk from last week, but there's also a talk from sorry, the name is just gone from me, but we've had talks on school stress and anxiety. There's a whole range of different recorded presentations in there that I'm sure you'll find interesting. So you can just scroll through them and you'll find them. Again, finish up by saying, Katie and Madeleine, thanks again so much. And we had over 300 people online for most of this evening. So that'll tell you how much interest there is in this topic. And I think you've helped an awful lot of people tonight.
So thank you for asking us. And I'm really sorry we didn't get around to all the questions that people have, because I know there's a real need for information out there.
There is lots of information out there, and the Mental Health Foundation, the HSE, the Lucena website, there's lots of information there available to people.
Thanks, Katie. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.